Welcome, everyone. We are just giving it a minute or two to let our folks find the link and join us. We're really happy that you're with us today for mastery-based education with a culturally responsive imagination. So nice to see so many familiar friends from New York City, Los Angeles, and everywhere in between. It's very exciting to be here with everybody today. Want to invite everyone. It looks like a lot of people are putting your name and your city. If you want to say something about your role as an educator or otherwise, that would be great. We'd love to know who's in the room with us. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Okay, just want to say a warm welcome to everyone who's here. We are here to talk about mastery-based learning with a culturally responsive imagination. This is part of a collaboration between Mastery Collaborative from the New York City Department of Education and NYU Metro Center's research group. Leah and Lindsay, you should certainly represent the name of your group. We've been working together to think about what does it look like when mastery-based and culturally responsive and sustaining education are implemented together in schools. And we're here to think through some of that with you today. We want to warmly invite many Mastery Collaborative educators who are here today to enrich the event with your expertise and ideas and questions and whatnot in the chat. Of course, inviting everyone to please be an active participant in all kinds of ways, but we have so much expertise in the room. So help push our thinking by sharing your thoughts and expertise there, please. So I'm Joy from Mastery Collaborative. I'm going to hand it off to Meg to introduce herself and then the Metro folks.
Hey all, I'm Meg Stentz from the Mastery Collaborative and thrilled to be with you.
I'll pop in next. Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Leah Q. Peoples, and I am one of the researchers at the Center for Policy Research and Evaluation, and very fortunate to partner with the Mastery Collaborative on this project. It has been really a great partnership, and so excited at this point to be able to share this workshop based on, a really key finding from our work. So I'm excited to share that today. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and my contact information is there. I just wanted to say verbally, if you're feeling so inclined to tweet about this event, really, because we're calling you in to really workshop with us, right? This is not the kind of passive workshop where you sit and just receive information, but we're really going to be workshopping, like, what does this look like? We're all gonna do that today together. If you hear any really interesting nuggets of information, wisdom, questions, things to consider, please use the hashtag CREimagination, and I'll drop that in the chat as well if you happen to be on Twitter. If not, that's no problem either. But again, it's nice to meet you all. And I will pass it to Lindsay.
Thanks, Leah. Hi, everybody. My name is Lindsay Foster. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I also am a researcher at the NYU Metro Center along with Leah, and very excited to invite all of you to join us in this conversation about what does CRE imagination look like, and to continue this webinar and workshop some ideas that we found in our study, and really excited to hear from y'all and understand where y'all are from. So thanks so much for joining us.
So we're just inviting everyone as you join to let us know where you're from, how long you've been working on mastery or competency-based learning and culturally responsive and sustaining education. What is your school and your role? And it looks like we have folks here from Connecticut, Los Angeles, Brooklyn, New York, Newark, Bronx, Manhattan, Atlanta, Harlem, more Brooklyn in the house. Never can have too much Brooklyn. Great Schools Partnership. Great to have you here. Great. Nice to see some of our friends from Los Angeles Unified here today too.
So thanks so much, Joy, for getting us started and introducing folks who are in the room. So glad to have y'all from all over the country. So as I mentioned before, my name is Lindsay Foster, and I worked on this culturally responsive mastery-based education project along with Leah. And we had a whole host of support from Joy and Meg and the folks at Mastery Collaborative. And so just to give a brief overview of the project to kind of orient y'all to what this is about and where we came up with this concept of a CRE imagination. So during the project, we explored 8 middle and high schools throughout New York City. Some of the high schools were in partnership with Mastery Collaborative, some of them were not. And so what we did within these high schools was we were examining the intersection of culturally responsive education and mastery-based education. We wanted to know, what do these two educational approaches look like when they're implemented together? And so this study was really ignited by researchers, educators, and practitioners who recognized that there was a need to implement culturally responsive practices and mastery-based systems to create better educational experiences for students of color, students with disabilities, and multilingual learners. And so this project was able to understand on a number of different levels and through varying methods what these two concepts look like when they are implemented together. And so we did this by looking at 3 research questions, which are here on the screen. The first is, what culturally responsive mastery-based education, or what you'll hear us refer to as CR-MBE, school-wide practices and policies are implemented at participating Mastery Collaborative schools? The second is, what CR-MBE mindsets, practices, skills do teachers at participating schools report? And the third is, what mastery-based education and culturally responsive education experiences did students at participating schools report? So we studied on 3 levels: the school, the teacher, adult educator role, and then also on the student level, to really understand what CR-MBE school systems, practices, skills, and mindsets really looked like. And so we did this through a number of different ways. The first was through interviews. We interviewed teachers, we interviewed administrators, staff, and students. A lot of the students we interviewed in focus groups. We also did observations. So Mastery Collaborative had several events where we observed schools discussing what their mastery-based approaches looked like, what their culturally responsive approaches looked like. These included some of the quarterly meetings that Mastery Collaborative held at the Department of Education and at Tweed. And we also did tours of schools. So when we toured some of the schools, we were able to sort of understand what they were doing in the actual classroom, how students were experiencing these educational approaches as well. The third thing that we looked at was we did document review. And so what you'll also hear folks call it is an artifact review, where we looked at lesson plans, the school curriculum structure, along with several other documents, grading, policies, syllabi, to really understand what mastery-based and culturally responsive education look like from a school perspective. So what practices are they implementing in the classroom and on the school level that really tap into those 2 educational approaches? And then the fourth and final method that we did this was through surveying. We surveyed teachers and we surveyed students to really get an understanding of of what their experience was like. We asked several questions to understand how these experiences occurred for them. And we tried to look at some patterns and understand what was occurring both on the teacher and the student level to get a better understanding at some of those research questions that I just read for you. So there were several findings that we had throughout the study, but for the purpose of today's webinar, I'll just highlight 2 of them. So one of them is that all the schools that we engaged with and that participated in the study shared strong mastery-based education systems. However, there was very little evidence of culturally responsive educational systems beyond implementation of advisory groups. And so to very briefly explain what advisory groups are for folks who may not use them in their schools, or perhaps you haven't heard of them, advisory groups are, from our understanding and observation and interviews with teachers, advisory is a sort of a non-academic classroom structure where teachers are assigned students and they engage with students sometimes on like social political conversations. They engage with students sometimes on non-academic assignments. And sometimes they engage with students in non-school related activities, meaning that they get to know students on a personal level. This is how a lot of the educators tapped into getting to know their students' families. And so they use advisory as a way to do that. And so then the other finding we found is that very few teachers reported having classroom practices characterized by active student decision-making and co-constructed curriculum, which demonstrated that mastery-based education is a school-wide choice and CRE is typically an individual teacher-specific strategy. So this finding really taps into the one that I just read before that, where schools on a school-wide level have a very strong mastery-based education system. However, CRE was more of an individual specific choice for teachers in their classroom and not necessarily on a wide array, on a wide level of all teachers and educators in the school building. So what does that have to do with CR-MBE imagination? So there are a couple of considerations that you kind of have to make, and I'm gonna really quickly go through these. So there are 6 that I'll go through. So there's the iterative nature of culturally responsive education, meaning that it can't be done once and that's it. You have to constantly come back to it. It's a cyclical thing. The second is there's an intentional process with applying a CR-MBE imagination. So you can't just put CRE on the top when on top of MBE. You have to actively integrate them and be intentional in that. And as you're doing that, that taps into the third one, where there are some tensions between these two educational approaches, and you have to consider what's being privileged when you resolve these tensions. So the educational approaches, as I mentioned, they're very separate on their own. And those tenets, those theories have to be considered when you are applying a CR-MBE imagination. And the fourth one is the power dynamics. There's a lot of power dynamics that occur in school between educators, schools, families, students, communities. And this also has to be considered. Who's being privileged? Who's allowed to hold power? How does power sharing occur? And then the sixth and final one is there's a collaboration. So when applying a CR-MBE imagination, it's not just between schools and folks who attend the schools. It's between all education stakeholders, especially tapping into that community aspect that I mentioned and that we'll also talk about as we go on through the webinar.
So now we're getting into applying that culture responsive and sustaining imagination to MBE. So the way that this entire workshop is set up is that we pretty much brainstormed a couple different areas of practice, and you see them all on the screen. So we've got grading, hiring, discipline, classroom practices, school policies, student activities, mindsets, family engagement, and curriculum. These are places where we are imagining that CRSC can be applied. And we're also going to talk about 3 of these areas right now and how we apply to CRE imagination to kind of give us a little bit of foreground before we break out into groups. And you all will pick one of these areas to actually workshop and work collaboratively to think about how we apply CRSC imagination to these areas. So if you just go to the next slide, Lindsay, the 3 areas we're going to talk about is grading, classroom practices, and family engagement. And then you all will choose your area of practice when you break out with your different groups. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Mastery Collaborative to kick us off.
Thank you so much. I just want to say we have learned quite a lot from our partnership with NYU Metro Center. So we're very, very grateful for the learning that we've done with you so far and are continuing to do. I want to ask everyone, I want to ask all of you folks who are here to share out, think for a minute about a space where you feel a deep sense of belonging, and let us know in the chat box, please. Thank you for naming family in your writing community. That's awesome. Does anybody feel a deep sense of belonging in Zoom? Writing workshops, that's great. Thank you, Heather. Megan is saying in a university settings, having intense dialogues with peers about social issues and policies. Leah is saying among friends. Lorraine used to feel this way in church, but no more. Carrie mentions her sorority. Chloe's mentioning friends and family. Lindsay saying chosen family. That one really resonates with me too. With my grade team and mini equity group at my school. Thank you, Johanna. Marjorie says home, school, friends, and fishing. That sounds like life, Marjorie. Thank you so much. We ask this because what we really hope is for all of our young people to feel a deep sense of belonging in their school, which we know is somewhat aspirational in some places and cases around the city, but that's our aspiration. It's our imagination, is that every student feels a sense of belonging, a sense of being responded to and sustained in their school. Thank you, everyone. Oh, Marjorie, it's so great that your team, your MC team at your school is a place where you feel belonging. That bodes well for the work at your school. Jessica's saying with people who have a similar background, that's a super interesting response. Thank you so much. People are mentioning family, friends, good friends. Awesome, thank you. That's very, very helpful. So we're going to talk just for really just a few minutes to get a little peek in a window at what does it mean to combine a mastery-based approach and a culturally responsive approach. So this is sort of like an appetizer version, not the meal, and certainly not the cookbook. So culturally responsive and sustaining education goal for this few minutes is to develop or deepen a working understanding of what is cultural competence and its power and impact. And your mastery-based learning goal for the next few minutes is that you can develop and deepen a working understanding of design and the use of learning outcomes. So let's roll. Thank you, Lindsay. So culturally responsive and sustaining education is all premised on the work of Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings, who in the mid-90s named culturally relevant education with these three pillars underlying all of it, which is first, all students can and must experience academic success. We could talk for hours about what that might mean. Students must develop and or maintain cultural competence, and students must develop critical consciousness, also called socio-political consciousness, that gives them the agency to challenge the status quo of the current social order. So this has developed over the years and evolved over the years into culturally responsive and sustaining education. But at the heart are the three pillars that were named by Dr. Gloria Ladson-Billings. So we're going to look at this pillar here, cultural competence. So what is cultural competence? It's the ability to be clear about who you are in your intersecting identities, to understand how you show up in a space, what your lenses might be, having a curiosity and willingness to learn about the identities, cultural practices, and worldviews of others, a positive attitude toward identity, cultural difference, and a readiness to welcome, respect, and celebrate those differences. These are really important things to do in a world where so many teachers don't share cultural and racial identities necessarily with their students. So we believe that to be truly youth-centered or student-centered entails aspects of cultural competence. Thank you so much. So what's at stake? Zaretta Hammond names different levels of culture, going from sort of surface level, which is not to say insignificant, because these surface level things that she names, food, music, dress, holidays, if you are sort of decoding a space that you walk into, you can sort of quickly see whether there's space for you or not, based sometimes only on what is being displayed in that surface culture way. But then we get down to mental models. These are our most deeply held beliefs. These are the beliefs and the sort of driving forces that make us most convinced that our way of doing it is right and other ways of doing it are problematic for us. And so synergies at all these different levels of culture can create a lot of sense of belonging and warmth, and clashes in any of these places can have different levels of emotional charge. So we want to be sure that we are able to work with folks from backgrounds that are not, that is not based around similarity, that we're able to work effectively with others who are different from us, however we experience that difference. Thank you so much, Lindsay. So if we had more time, it would be so great to do a deep dive into the collective wisdom in this room about the various aspects of what does it mean to be culturally competent. There are many, many different components to cultural competence. There's inner work and inner awarenesses. And then there's a large number of sort of social moves, social capacities that are involved in cultural competence. So a mastery-based approach to building and fostering cultural competence in ourselves and in others would ask us to be really clear about what are the things that are entailed in cultural competence. Similar to if you were trying to get good at a sport, you would need to know the rules of the sport and all of the, you know, ball handling skills, passing skills, team skills, all that kind of stuff. So these are some of the things named by a group of educators about cultural competence. And then to name them in learning outcomes, I invite you to grab the slide deck. There's a lot more information here about learning outcomes, but once you get clear on the skills and capacities and awarenesses that are components of this larger skill, you can name them in I can statements and then teach and coach them over time. And then learning outcomes become a sort of really coherent through line that influences everything from your curriculum design to how you're coaching and supporting students, the kinds of roles students are playing in the classroom, the kinds of feedback they're getting, the kinds of assessment that's happening and whatnot. And I want to ask Meg to please share out this is a guide to creating effective learning outcomes. We can't go through it right now, but just wanted you to have the Mastery Collaborative community's best wisdom on creating effective learning outcomes. And we'll share that link to you in the chat, as well as the link also to the slides. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna let this slide go in the interest of time and turn it over to Meg to talk about grading.
Thanks, Joy. So I really appreciated what Lindsay was saying, introing the study about there being different tension points between mastery and culturally responsive education. And I think that grading is definitely a place where we feel some tension. We have a quote here from a student who we actually have Katya and Kate, the principal of Harvest Collegiate, with us today. And Caitlin says about her experience being graded that all through middle school, I felt like grades do represent who I am. You know, if I have 100, that means I'm a perfect person. And if I have a 60, then I'm just no one. So those are pretty big stakes for getting grading right for our young people, right? So at stake here, we have students' whole sense of self, how they feel about their capacities, their worth. It definitely impacts our relationships with young people in the classroom. But then there's a serious credentialing too, right? Something I was thinking when Lindsay was talking about, like, we need to pay attention to what we're prizing at these decision points. It doesn't mean that being like super groovy means that our schools are going to be more equitable, right? Grades also function as credentials that give students access to next level opportunities. So part of our challenge as educators is imagining a different future and working as equitably as we can in this current system. So we're going to talk a little bit about what mastery-based education posits for grading being more equitable, but we're not yet in that reimagined dream state, right? So you can go to the next slide, Lindsay. Thanks. A book that we love is Grading for Equity, and Joe Feldman, the author of that book, says that grading is the third rail of teaching and learning. Its power courses through every part of our schools, and if we can make adjustments to how we grade to be more equitable, we can alter how our schools function. That's a little bit of the promise there. So thinking about how grades function in a traditional system is to think about them as rewards and as punishments, and they're often based a lot around compliance. This is no one's intention, I think, or it's almost no one's intention, but ways that it shows up is taking points off for not turning work in on time, or having these rigid structures that end up assessing students' abilities to follow the rules of school instead of really being clear communication about what students know and can do. So a mastery system, on the other hand, lets us reimagine grades a little bit differently. Lindsay, if you'll go to the next slide for us. In a mastery-based, thank you. In a mastery-based system, grades serve as feedback about what a student knows and can do. And that feedback is just about 1 point in time. So grades become something that can change, and students won't be penalized for not understanding a concept early on in the semester, right? So what that has to mean then is that we're disaggregating sort of the learning pieces from these other compliance pieces. And the way that some of our schools do that is by separating out work habits that are academic, like you see at the top, from work habits that are just compliance-based, but still important, right? Like we definitely know that young people still need to figure out how to manage deadlines if they're going to be successful in the world. But if they haven't learned that when they're 11, do we need to penalize them with a grade, or do we need to give them coaching and feedback and have a more clear conversation? So the goal in a mastery-based system is that when a young person sees their grade, they're not seeing a bunch of smushed up information, like you're a C at math. That doesn't give them any actionable feedback, but instead we give them clear, like you've reached your goal around statistics and probability, and what you need to work more on is self-advocacy, asking for help when you get stuck, so that they know their next step. So we have to reimagine lots of pieces of schooling for grades to function this way, right? This little image is an assessment plan, a unit plan, where we are clearly communicating learning outcomes and goals, and then giving students multiple opportunities to show what they know in a low stakes way with lots of coaching and feedback in between. We also have to think, like, if they don't get it right at the beginning of the unit, isn't that kind of to be expected? And what system do we have in place to give them support and reassess, right? And then we have all of this, the idea of grades as feedback goes hand in hand with this growth mindset piece, changing the language so that you don't feel like a 60, a not perfect person. You feel like you're either meeting this academic goal, which is separate from yourself, right? It's not who you are. It's out there, and its criteria are not moving. And we give students lots of glows and grows along the way, and that iteration is to be expected. Thanks. So a starting place as we think about reimagining could be to consider questions like this, problems of practice, and sit with some tension points. And as Lindsay suggested, like parse out what we're prizing when we make these decisions. So one prompt that I appreciate comes from Dr. Justin Tart, who says, I'm comfortable giving the student who needs 4 attempts to demonstrate mastery of a skill the same grade as the student who needed 1 attempt. If a student learns is more important to me than when. So we need to sit and reconsider lots of these problems of practice, because mastery is not already culturally responsive and sustaining. We have to continually iterate and bring this lens to this reimagining. Thanks, I'll hand it over.
All right, thank you both Joy and Meg for sharing more about how to apply culture responsive engagement to grading and to other practices. And we're going to transition now into thinking about family engagement. So we figured it'd be good to have a conversation about what is culturally responsive family engagement, right? And then how do we bring CRSC family engagement together with MBE to ultimately get to CR-MBE? So much of this is about what we've imagined the possibilities are, but they're not necessarily things that have played out yet in schools and in different classrooms and areas, but places that we've identified as potential opportunities. So join us for our journey. We're going to start off by talking about what is culturally responsive, sustaining family engagement. This definition comes from the Education, Justice, Research, and Organizing Collaborative. It is a group that I work with as the research director. We work with a lot of community-based organizations and parent leaders, et cetera. And so really this definition and the following components are rooted in those relationships, very strong, close relationships working with parents, specifically BIPOC parents, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, okay? So CRS family engagement, culturally responsive and sustaining, that's what CRS stands for. Family engagement is the practice of authentic, equal partnership with families rooted in deep knowledge and appreciation for the rich social and cultural identities, assets, and contexts that families bring to learning. Thank you for dropping the link to this document, Lindsay. Next slide, please. There are several key components of CRS family engagement. The first is families and their cultures are positioned as assets and they're central to learning. So they're not kind of reached out to when it seems like a good time, but rather they're central to the entire process of learning, the entire experience of MBE or schools in general. Also, families are cherished and educators invest in building authentic relationships between educators and families, okay? So that notion of being cherished, of being cared for, of feeling sacred, feeling honored, like you belong here, of course, this space is designed for you and your students, and we cherish you here. We really respect and value you being here. The next couple of components include educators are allies and partners with families and the project of education and supporting children. So thinking about parents and families, we use both parents and families because not all students have parents, but for the most part, students have different sets of families, chosen families, et cetera. But educators are allies and partners. And of course, that calls us to think about what does it mean to be an ally to families? What does that look like? How do we do that, right? Rather than seeing families as allies and supporting educators. So a lot of times we see this right in the work where we think about how we can work with families to help us as educators educate students. And we got to flip that sometimes. We got to think about reciprocity in a really critical way. And what I mean by reciprocity is that give and take, that relationship. The next one says that educators acknowledge, honor, and leverage the funds of knowledge that all families bring to student learning. So funds of knowledge is essentially a term used to describe what families and communities may already know that can be talked about in the classroom, that can be learned in the classroom, that can help frame context and lessons and histories and things of that nature. Then we have educators acknowledge, honor, and leverage the community cultural wealth that all families and neighborhoods contribute to student learning. So really when we start thinking about funds of knowledge and community cultural wealth, it's really the intentional work to recognize the legitimacy of different families and communities' offerings, whether it's how they know what they know, whether it's the processes or procedures of doing something within the community, whether it's like the institutional or community knowledge, etc. The main point of it is that there is a cultural wealth. This comes out of Tara Yoso's work that families have to offer to help students to navigate. And there's about 7 different types of cultural capital that she talks about between aspirational and navigational, etc. And so if you're interested in those, definitely look them up because they can help to frame ways that parents and families and communities can be incorporated into the classroom and what types of cultural knowledge they might have that maybe we're not really making central to the classroom space. And then educators meet families where they are, rather than waiting and expecting families to meet the school and educators where they are. So again, this is, Yoso's last name is Y-O-S-S-O, first name Tara. The idea behind this, again, is this idea that it's not just about getting into relationship with families and communities so that we can do a better job, like just for our purposes, for our betterment, but really returning that reciprocity, making sure that we're meeting where families are as well. Next slide, please. So the last couple that we'll talk about is accepting that the effectiveness of family engagement is measured in impact, not intention. I'm going to read this a second time because I think it's so important, because oftentimes, we do think about our own intentions and our own efforts towards family engagement, but really we have to accept that the effectiveness of family engagement is measured in impact and not in intention, okay? So let's just sit with that for a moment, because I know sometimes that can be like, a real shift, right? Because I think a lot of our training tells us that, our efforts to include families and communities, et cetera, is really going to be enough. Even if we have, these great intentions, ultimately, if they're not felt by the communities and by students' families, then we're not really being successful in that engagement, in that partnership, in creating that sense of allyship. The next one says, parents and caretakers and families are seen as partners of equal power, experts on their children and their communities, and problem solvers, not problems to be solved. And so there's a lot to unpack in this as well that we won't have time to get into. But I think what's really important to highlight here is partners of equal power. This sometimes can be like a little bit tricky, right? Because as educators, we have a responsibility to educate students, and we've got all of these different demands that are coming from so many, different places. Sometimes it's hard to imagine how a parent can be equal partners. But again, this is a place for us to push applying that CRE imagination to MBE to think about, okay, well, what could that look like if parents were equal partners? And how could that be responsive, right? So that it's not overwhelming, overburdening to either party. And then finally, recognize that families' overall well-being is an essential precondition of student learning, and that schools play a critical role in society by promoting that well-being, whether directly or through community partnerships. So that's just some considerations to kind of get us started and get us framed what exactly is culturally responsive family engagement to begin with. There is an entire workshop series that EJ Rock is doing with the NYC DOE that's hosting free workshops on culturally responsive family engagement. Feel free to join any of those. I do not readily have that information available, but once I switch over, I'll look through my emails and pull those links out in case anybody wants to join them. So now that we know about culturally responsive and sustaining family engagement, I want to talk a little bit about what does that mean within MBE systems. Our study found that most culturally responsive and sustaining family engagement was implemented through advisories, okay? So Lindsay talked about this a little bit earlier, so I won't repeat too much, but essentially advisories are small groups of students who are led by a staff person in the building, and typically that staff person stays with that advisory group for the matriculation, through a student's matriculation at that school. And advisories are used as a way to be a single point of contact that parents and families and community members can use to interact with the student and to understand what's happening at the school across multiple courses, contexts, things of that nature. So essentially, it's kind of this efficient system of bringing all of these resources and people together and kind of like this feedback loop all into a singular advisor who then relays that information to parents and families through phone calls, text messages. They have their own sets of intimate ways of like being in community with each other, and they are usually responsive to parents and families' needs in that communication highway. However, pretty much culturally responsive and sustaining family engagement didn't happen anywhere else outside of these advisory groups for the large part. And so this really prompted us to ask this question about, well, what would culturally responsive and mastery-based education look like together? So that's the next question on this next slide. And I'm just gonna say it one more time. What could culturally responsive, mastery-based family engagement look like? Well, we're gonna give you some of our ideas. We cut this down to 3 to make sure we could fit into our time slot. So 1, talking about CR-MBE grading systems. So we talked about grading earlier, but we're gonna add a spin that focuses on family engagement. Then we're going to talk about this concept of learning anytime, anywhere that often comes up in competency-based education literature. And then also doing CR-MBE with families with vulnerable students. And by vulnerable students, we're talking about students who are Black and Latinx, students with disabilities, and multilingual learners. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we're focusing on those populations. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay to present our first area.
Thanks so much, Leah. So When we came up with this idea of CRS family engagement, there are sort of three categories that we wanted to think through this with. The first is considerations. And so one of the considerations that we kind of have to make when you think about CR-MBE grading systems is you have to interrogate the common grading beliefs, assumptions about mastery-based education to see if they hold up to CRE principles. For example, the belief that transparency leads to equal understanding. One of the things that's absolutely wonderful about mastery-based education, and you can read it in the literature as well, is that there is a level of transparency that students, educators, and families tend to have with the students' grading progress, their learning progress, and how they're doing in the course. However, what we found is that the idea that everyone is transparent does not mean that there is an equal understanding of what this transparency necessarily means. So we spoke with educators and we spoke with students who say, you know, I have an approaching in one of my learning outcomes in this course, and their families have no idea what that is. They're like, okay, well, is that an A? Like, how are you doing? Like, what does that mean? You know, so there's a level of transparency, and sometimes folks use grading platforms. Some of you may be familiar with jump rope, but you know, there's this level of transparency that does not equate to a level of understanding across the board. So there's that consideration. And so in order to reimagine it, we would think that you have to kind of co-create a system that families actually understand and contribute to. So simply because there is a level of transparency doesn't mean that families have contributed to that existing structure, nor do they actually understand it. And so then that also means that there are learning targets that are defined by not just educators and not just folks in the school building, but also by families. So is there a way for families to say, this is what my child may need to learn? Here is what I feel like they need to learn. And an element of both mastery-based education and culturally responsive education, and I won't get too much into it because that's the learning anytime, anywhere, but is that young people are able to really understand lessons in the classroom that apply to their real life. And so this is a place where families can kind of tap in to these learning targets as defined by educators and the families and say, this is what my student or students need to learn. How can we make that happen? And so those are the first two elements of the grading system. And then the third one is possible practices. And so these are just kind of some questions. You answer these questions to help you get into reimagining what this particular element may look like. So what do students need to know in order to be successful in life? Based on not just students, but also families, right? So then also, what do students need to know for a future that does not exist yet? So again, thinking about something in the future and reimagining this space for students. How can these beliefs be incorporated into learning targets, understanding student learning, and tools used to communicate student progress? So once again, going back to those elements that I spoke to previously about understanding the need for these learning targets to be co-created with young people and their families and the students. And so then you also do these things how? That's what the by kind of answers is by hosting a semi-annual collaborative event, making these questions part of a project-based assignment for classwork. A lot of y'all are familiar with project-based assignments in your schools. You may use them in your classrooms. You can also do this by creating surveys and asking these questions at existing community events. And so a lot of these practices are done to reach out to families where they are to ensure that, as Leah mentioned previously, that they are equal partners and have an equal shared power in this structure for their students. So I'll pass this back on over to Leah to take us through the learning anytime, anywhere.
Yes. So some considerations, and thank you for sharing that, Lindsay, because I think that's just such a great place to start with. Is like, how do we co-create some of those learning targets? And I know for me, I'd be thinking about what are learning targets for liberation, like according to families, right? Like, what do they need to know in addition to just like the comprehension and being able to argue? Like maybe there's like an additional set of 5 that is specifically around some other types of things that are really maybe framed or centered in like people's lived experiences as well. But for CR-MBE, learning anytime, anywhere, some of the considerations that we took for this was, do learning spaces only exist within the school, within white communities or spaces? And what do CR-MBE classrooms look like outside of school look like? So this idea that you see a lot in the literature is that learning can happen anytime, anywhere. And so if that's the case, and we can really just open up the classroom to be a lot of different spaces, then what could that look like if we're being intentional about being culturally responsive, right? Where do we see that at? What does that look like? And then also family and community knowledge is valued and integrated into the classroom, the school, the curriculum. So whether that classroom is physically within the school or beyond the school as well. So some of the imagining that we did around this was looking for opportunities for students to learn by working outside the classroom and with communities. And we thought that students could help families and communities problem solve actual issues that communities are already working on. So what you'll see is this kind of positioning of family and communities, because focusing on a particular family is very individualistic in nature as opposed to collective, but focusing on issues that communities face may be a more collective approach to troubleshooting or problem solving or addressing issues from an actual community of people that multiple people experience as opposed to just one family. So some possible practices for what this could look like is that we could be situating a project. And educators, students, and families could identify a key area or project they'd like to work on within a specific community. So maybe they're doing some background research, they're thinking about what different community-based organizations are doing. Maybe there's a town hall that came up, or recent bills, or things of that nature that's really community-driven, not necessarily driven by politicians, not necessarily driven by people with official types of power and authority, but really coming from the community. And then the classrooms reaching out to family, community members, or community-based organizations to learn more about that project and those efforts. And then students potentially conducting additional research to learn more about the issue. And then classrooms and communities working in partnership to problem solve the real world. So again, I'm thinking a lot about the work done with different community-based organizations at NYU Metro Center. And so often there are already folks who are advocating for different things in different neighborhoods and different communities, et cetera. And that ability to partnership with these different organizations is one way to decenter very traditional classroom experiences into community spaces for learning, and for students to be able to move down that learning progression rubric, for lack of better words. One note though, this also requires us to be really intentional about when we're engaging with students, to have those critical conversations. So we mentioned earlier on that a key tenet of culturally responsive education is this idea around socio-political consciousness or critical consciousness. So anytime you have students entering a community, assuming that the students in that classroom are not all from the same community, that also requires teachers and students to prepare themselves to enter communities, to identify the socio-political context and histories of those communities, and being very mindful and intentional about how to ally and partner and enter and exit those communities in really appropriate ways.
Finding the unmute button on here can be a challenge sometimes, but thanks, Leah. So I'll wrap it up with the families with vulnerable students. And again, Leah mentioned that when we consider vulnerable students for this particular study, we focused on students of color, students with disabilities, and multilingual learners. And so I'll get into why we focused on those students. And so based on the literature that we found, and that we read, and the experiences that we had, we understood that there are varying experiences that these three groups of students have compared to students of color and white students. And when you zone into students of color, we're specifically talking about Black and Latinx students. And so we wanted to know, what does CR-MBE design specifically for those vulnerable groups look like? So when we think about culturally responsive master-based education, how are we imagining it for those three groups of young people to really optimize, or like create the best educational environment for them? And so that looks like, or can look like, we discussed creating spaces, opportunities, understandings, and collaborations that are responsive to their family needs. And then also inviting them into the school physically, virtually, if you are in a hybrid space, or folks are not comfortable in the space coming into the school just yet, or join them anywhere learning will take place. Again, going back to what Leah just mentioned, which is a very central point of master-based education, is that learning can happen anytime and any place. And one thing that I also want to say is, and this taps into Dr. Yasso's work about community cultural wealth, is that school is not the only place that learning takes place for young people. So the physical school building is not the only place where young people learn different lessons. It's certainly not where they learn about their identity, or they learn about social political consciousness. And so really understanding what CR-MBE can look like, you have to go outside of the classroom space and understand that there are a wide array of spaces and opportunities where young people are learning, and where you really can bring their families and their communities into this space with them. And so a possibility in practice that you can look at is a level of restoration. So outline the harm or the trauma that's been caused by the school to these families and ways to restore those past and current transgressions. And so what that might look like is developing policy strategies and mechanisms that hold educators, and schools accountable specifically to those groups that we mentioned. And so understand for your specific school, what does it mean to be accountable to those groups? What does accountability look like? How do you hold accountability for those groups? And how can we possibly be accountable in a way that creates the best educational environment for those students, keeping in mind those considerations that I mentioned at the start, and then also the four of us have mentioned throughout this webinar. And so understanding that there are experiences that young people have in school and their experiences that their families have that are traumatizing for them. A lot of times it can be from a power dynamic. And what does that power dynamic look like? How can you reimagine that power dynamic to make them equal partners and make their families have a shared level of power within their school? So right now, there's a lot of talking going on. And so before we tap into our breakout groups and before y'all begin to actually workshop this together, what we're gonna do is instead of a 10-minute break, so that we can optimize our time, Leah, where are we in terms of time for this?
So I was actually going to recommend that we do a quick poll of the audience. That was a lot of information and a lot to digest. And so I was wondering if maybe we can either do a 5-minute break or we can go right into the breakout groups and maybe just seeing what folks want to do. So to frame that as a question to the audience, if you would like a 5-minute break, just type in 5-minute break in the chat. And if you would prefer to go right into breakout rooms, you can type that too. Just try to get a sense of what the critical mass wants to do. Okay. Last call. Got some mixed responses. Man, it looks pretty even. All right, so we're gonna split this in half. So what we'll do is we will have people go into their breakout rooms, but give you all a start of 6:02, 6:03. That way we do a little bit of both. That way, if you need a couple minutes just to digest, you can do that. But as soon as you finish digesting, you can go ahead and get started at 6:02, 6:03. While you are in breakout rooms, basically what you're going to be doing is following the same pattern that we've talked about, considering what considerations need to be made as you're wanting to apply a culture responsive imagination to mastery-based areas of practice. And again, you'll see those areas of practice on the slide deck. And then 2, you'll want to talk about what are the imaginings that go along with that. And 3, what are some possible practices that you can plant with that. So the areas of practice are right here. You can go one more ahead one more time. Thank you. You also want to talk about community agreements before you get started. Here's a few just to get you started. We won't go over them today because we're a little short on time. But making space and sharing space, that means ensuring that people are able to share one mic, not having too many people talk at one time. Oops, ouch. If someone says something that's offensive or as a problem, you can say ouch. If you feel like you've made that mistake or you're hearing someone's ouch, you say oops. Cookie dough. You don't have to wait for the perfect time to speak, even if your thought isn't fully formed. Like sometimes it's okay to just kind of express where you're at instead of waiting for perfection. And then anything else you can add in your groups as well. So there's a list of folks. You can go ahead. You can go ahead past this. There's a list of folks by their breakout rooms, so feel free to go ahead and jump into them. In the chat, there's a link to the breakout rooms with the directions, who you're working with, and what you should be doing. When we come back, we're going to ask each group, maybe just a few people, because now we're at about 24. We're going to ask people to share maybe for about a minute what they discussed, but you're going to take an actual 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll send out little communications for when to come back in. You're gonna spend 15 to 20 minutes actually workshopping this. So you're gonna apply the CRE lens to an MBE area of practice, one of the ones you see on the PowerPoint. You're gonna find your group number and go to that corresponding slide. They're all color coded so that you don't accidentally write on someone else's slide. And you're gonna workshop through them. Throughout this time, the four of us will kind of pop into a couple different rooms to see if we can help people if they need any. So with that being said, I realized I took up the break. We're actually still gonna take the break because I wanna honor the need for a break. So we'll start at 6:05 and then folks will get started. All right, any questions in the chat?
I just want to
Yeah.
reiterate really quickly, Leah, thank you, that there are several rooms. And so it's on this slide and it's also listed on this slide because there were so many registrants. We do not have nearly as many participants today, which is perfectly fine. But you can look at the link that Joy dropped in and find your breakout room on there as well. So I'm going to pause on screen sharing so that folks can go into their breakout rooms accordingly.
All right, thanks everyone. Join your breakout rooms, get started at 6:05. See you soon. All right, so what are folks thinking? Are we thinking about grading, hiring, discipline, classroom practices? There's a lot of options here. If I knew we were doing this as a whole group, I would have just did 3 to pick from. So I see one person's interested in grading, one family engagement. What are other folks thinking and feeling? Maybe other folks are okay with anything, maybe? Interested in all, but especially grading, family engagement, student activities, mindsets, yes. Okay, this is pretty varied. What about facilitators and panelists? Do y'all have any preferences? Excuse me. It seems like a continuation of grading might be popping up here. I'm seeing that a lot. And I hate to do this, through a democracy, because we all know democracy doesn't work for everybody, especially marginalized populations. So that's my caveat. But in this case, since we got to make, some changes on the fly, I see grading coming up in a lot of different spaces. So why don't we start with grading? So if you've got your PowerPoint open, let's all go to group 1. We're going to be group 1 together. And the first question asks us to think about what considerations, and Lindsay, if you don't, you're sharing your screen, can you type in there grading into the area of practice so we all remember what we're working on? But as we're looking at that slide, and again, we're all in this group together as a collective, the first question is like, what considerations do we need to make as we're thinking about grading? So what considerations? Again, this can just be thoughts, they can just be questions, and we want to apply a culture responsive imagination to MBE grading, right? And we don't want to just sprinkle it in, like we said, we had those 6 key factors we were talking about at the very beginning, where we want to integrate CRE with MBE as opposed to just adding it in. All right, so let's kick it off. What are folks thinking? You can grab a Post-it note and you can write directly onto it. Just don't write on anyone else's Post-it note. Feel free to raise your hand if you also want to speak. I believe you all have voice privileges. You might not have video privileges, but I think voice. All right, Carrie. Oh, wait, that disappeared. Maybe you didn't mean it. No worries. So what are the considerations you want to make when it comes to integrating CRE and MBE into grading practices? FYI, access is view only. Oh, we can change that.
It should be working for you now, Chloe.
So CRC imagination would need to contend with the history of grading as a harmful ranking/sorting mechanism. Yeah, for sure. Any other thoughts? We have, do students, families, and staff all understand the system? Right, that's definitely something that showed up in our research. Making sure the grades show mastery of skill, not just memorization. Yep. Learning standards and, oh, that's being edited. I'll come back to that. Including families in the process of changing to mastery-based grading, right? That whole transition process, and like, what does that mean to include families? What does it mean to have them part of the grading system? We spoke a little bit about, having additional learning targets. And so I wonder about, what types of competencies or skills are necessary, to get to liberation? What would parents tell us? What would students tell us even? Because although we're focused, on that presentation, we talked a lot about families and communities, but students can be a part of that process as well. Like what competencies would be really important for students to have when we're talking about liberation, when we're talking about allyship, et cetera, and demonstrating that and what that could look like. Traditionally, learning standards and therefore grades are often oriented towards whiteness. Yes. And I think too, like, especially how these grades and, the learning progression ultimately gets translated for, going to college. That came up as well through our research, is what happens when it's time to go to college. A lot of schools already had like equations for how to translate grade, some of the learning progression into grades that most people were more familiar with. And they also report that for New York City's DOE as well. But those are also important considerations as well. And then
I see one that I like, Leah, if you don't mind. So Anonymous Frog says, even if rubrics, competencies, and learning standards are clear and transparent, they're still subjective. How do we ensure that the subjectivity, and it seems like they're still editing it, but I like that one so far. They're clear and transparent, but they can be subjective. How do we get around that?
And I would push and I would wonder if subjectivity is a problem. Are we looking for universal truth and universal correctness, or is subjectivity okay? I like that too, though. All right. So we're gonna take maybe about 60 more seconds, and Meg, Joy, Lindsay, if there's anything that you wanna jump in with, please do. And if not, we're gonna take about another 60 seconds for people to write down ideas.
I see Molly adding the need for healing because students have had past negative experiences and trauma with grading. Lifting that up.
Yes, 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 yes. Can grades be healing? I love it. I never asked that question before. All right, we have about 15 seconds left before we move into the next slide. So I just see a few more that popped on here. Another part of grading work is helping our society evolve beyond learning as a competitive sport. And then being clear on grades as feedback versus grades as credentials. Yeah. All right. So with that being said, we're going to go into our next slide. So if everyone goes on to slide 55. And now we're going to focus on imagining. So the difference between imagining and possible practices is essentially imagining is high level big dreaming, meaning you don't have to worry about money. You don't have to worry about boundaries. There's nothing that can stop us from doing culture responsive mastery-based education. Let's imagine what this would look like ideally. Sorry about the light. And when we go into possible practices, we'll work on making those a little bit more practical, a little bit more realistic, putting them into a vehicle that makes sense for our classrooms, our schools, and our community spaces. So starting with the imagining, go big, go bold. This is the time to be bold. And again, this is all about how we're incorporating CRE and MBE into grading and what that could look like going big. So I'll give folks some time to do that.
I like some of the ones that we're seeing so far, Leah. We're seeing that all teachers are on board. There are no grades at all. Grades close 0 doors and everything is possible. They're drawing from video games, coaching, and other areas where students get good feedback, which is a really good idea. There's sort of this idea that young people get positive remarks from a lot of other spaces. Why not internalize those same methods and implement them in the classroom? We've got collaborating with families and the children about their desired learning targets, which I think is a really good one, and students and families creating the learning outcomes. Again, going back to what we spoke about earlier about this co-creation, where families are seen as having equal power with the folks in the school building. So these are some really great ones.
Yeah, and if I could just trouble this a little bit while we're working on this, it's important to remember that not all groups of color or people of color, share the same beliefs and ideas, right? And one place where we see this is, in particular, with some Latinx communities, teachers are the authority, right? Teachers are the ones who make the decisions. They are the ones who have the expertise to make the determination about how the child or how the student is doing, and about what that looks like. And they may be more hesitant or resistant even to being invited into a collaborative space because that's traditionally not been how things have been done. So I think also what's important about imagining is really giving a lot of consideration and intentional thought about how we can create the conditions to invite students in to this process and their families into this process, right? So what does that look like? And it might look a little bit different for different groups because there might be different considerations to make. So when I'm imagining big about this, I'm also thinking about what conditions need to be in place for people to actually join this kind of co-creative space around grading and for that to be successful. What does that look like? What kinds of conversations need to be had? What kind of ground should be set? What kind of people need to be involved to make it successful? And is this something that can take place just like one time, or does it need to take place, several times over and over? All right, we'll take about a minute or so more on this slide. And again, Lindsay, Meg, Joy, if you want to add anything or if there's any comment that's sticking out to you that you just want to elevate, definitely do that. Feel free to elevate that now.
I see an idea about self-grading, and I both love that and know that like a lot of times young people are like harsh on themselves also because they've internalized all of the like toxic stuff about school and power. So just adding a layer of like, what would it look like for students to be able to like grade themselves from a place that's asset-based and strength-based and useful.
I also think, Meg, I saw that one and liked it a lot too. And I think that also could undo some of the trauma and harm that we spoke about earlier, helping kind of rectify some of those negative experiences that young people and their families have had when it comes to education and various elements of grading, family engagement, things like that. So I think that's a really great one.
All right. So with that, I see a couple people are still writing. Wonderful. And you'll have these PowerPoint slides. So if you want to share them with folks at your school to continue the conversation, or if you want to use the same framing to start a conversation at your school, feel free to do that. And there are some starting ideas right here on here as well. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and transition into our last slide, which is actually thinking about the possible practices that align with some of that big imagining. So again, some of the more concrete ways that we can integrate CRE and MBE grading. Like, what could that look like? All right, we see some ideas being dropped into the notes section. So one is family feedback. We do it for behavior rating scales. Students choosing when they are ready to have their work rated and by who. Goal setting and check-ins. Self-evaluation and setting realistic, personalized deadlines. Any other notes stand out to anyone that they'd like to read or talk through? We also have the oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think we were about to read the same one. The first week of school, their family conferences to collaborate on learning plans. I think that's really great. And I like that because from the very beginning, you are involving families. And I think that one way to really do this is also make them continual. So going back to that idea of CRE being iterative, constantly checking in with families on this learning plan, not when a student does not meet these targets and not when they need to be revisited, but just in general, and constantly doing it so that families are engaged in the process often.
Any other last thoughts that any of the panelists want to read out or share out before we go ahead and close out the workshop?
I would just like to bring in the idea of intent versus impact. I think there's a lot of intent around grading that is about controlling students and having them compete for the top spot and all that stuff. But even if we have an intention of equity, there can be a big gulf between what we're intending to do with our grading practices and what the actual impact is. So we need to really think about that equity principle of intent versus impact in all kinds of ways. Thanks,
Yeah.
Lindsay.
I'll just add one last thing. So I was not able to write it on the slide, but I will add it later. Is part of the research also showed, right, that even conceptualizations of CR-MBE impact different students differently. So the question that I'm asking is, how do these possible practices specifically impact Black students, specifically Latinx students? How do they either contribute to existing barriers or begin to break them down and build pathways towards having not just access, but this kind of transformative classroom experience, right? Thinking about the critical consciousness and socio-political consciousness, thinking about joy, thinking about liberation, thinking about learning, thinking about creating this future and how we want all students to be able to build this future. You know, so many educators that are in the Mastery Collaborative talked about preparing students for, you know, a world that doesn't quite exist yet. That came up quite a bit, right? And we want students to be in this great transformative world. Like, how does this ultimately prepare them to do that? But specifically Black students, specifically Latinx students, specifically students with disabilities, and how disability is culture, right? It's not just a thing to be responding to in terms of like bridging learning, but like disability as culture and what does that mean? And finally, multilingual learners as well. So I just wanted to say that to kind of close us out. That was my last few thoughts on like the actual possible practices. I'm gonna invite my panelists one more time if they wanna share anything else. And if not, I'm gonna go ahead and close this all the way out. Looks like we're good, possibly. Were you about to say something, Meg? I don't wanna cut you off, no? Okay. So I'm just gonna go ahead and close this out. And I just wanna say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Mastery Collaborative, Joy and Meg for being such amazing partners on this entire project. Lindsay, thank you so much for leading this workshop and just being a great partner and researcher on this project as well. I just wanna pass flowers out to everyone. You all are amazing. We've learned so much from this project. We do have links. We've got lots of links, lots of materials, lots of resources. Mastery Collaborative, if you're not already part of Mastery Collaborative, has maybe thousands of resources. They are the people to go to. So please link up with them. Lindsay, Meg, Joy, if there are links you want to drop in the chat so folks can have access to those or to hit you up either on Twitter or over email, etc. These are the folks that you want to be in community with. They have been thinking about implementing CRE and MBE and have such great insights. If you want to learn more about the CR-MBE research project, which is the culture responsive mastery-based research project, You can learn more by going to our KnowledgeWorks page. I want to thank KnowledgeWorks and thank students at the Center Research Collaborative because they have hosted this work and allowed it to be possible. And so check them out. Also check out Metro Center as well. We do all kind of work on equity in education, and we'll continue doing this work. Again, I just want to say that there is a free workshop that the NYC DOE has partnered with us on, specifically around culturally responsive and family engagement, but we also work with schools as well. So if you're interested in any of those things, please reach out to us. All of our contact information are on the slides. And I just want to really thank you for taking time to imagine and dream with us. And I hope that you will take this work into your schools with you tomorrow, this week, next week, and to keep giving it life and momentum. So that's my final piece. Lindsay, Meg, Joy, would you like to say any goodbyes?
I just want to say thanks so much to everyone. This webinar was absolutely amazing. I know we had some technical difficulties, but thank y'all so much for your patience and your flexibility, for doing it as a group. I think the smaller group definitely enabled us to be able to do that. Again, all of the information is in those resource folders. Thanks to y'all who engaged in the pre-work resources. Hopefully it didn't feel too much like homework. Thank y'all so much for attending. Share the bit.ly link. Any sort of nuggets that you share that you found worth talking about, discussing, feel free to use the hashtag CREimagination. But thank y'all again so much. Big, huge thank you to Joy and Meg and all the folks at Mastery Collaborative for continuing to partner with us and involve folks from the Mastery Collaborative across the country, not just here in New York City. So we really appreciate that. And thank y'all again for joining us.
Meg, Joy, any last words?
Just gratitude for all the learning from the study in this community. Thank you so much.
And appreciations to everyone for being here on a beautiful spring evening to try to serve students better. Big giant thank you. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Lindsay. Peace and let's keep learning.
All right, with that being said, someone asked before, a video will be available as soon as it passes accessibility checks, but that will be emailed to everyone who registered. Thanks so much, and everyone take care. Have a good night.